All right, guys. So today we will be going over a most overrated current UFC champs tier list. All right. So today we're going to be going over who is super overrated, who is properly rated, and who is underrated, and everything in between. So, starting off strong, we're going to start with Joshua Van with his very impressive recent victory over Tatsuro Taira, right? So, the thing about Joshua Van is that a lot of people are very critical of his victory over Alexandre Pantoja because of the way that fight ended, with Pantoja breaking his arm, and that was a very unfortunate ending for that fight. But in my opinion, we can't really hold that against Joshua Van. As he correctly said, a black belt should know how to fall, right? So Joshua Van, in my opinion, beat Pantoja fair and square. Now, it is not the traditional or orthodox ending of a fight. However, it is still, a win on Joshua Van's part. Now, as far as him being rated goes, I am still going to say that despite everything I just said, I am going to put Joshua Van at slightly overrated. I'm going to get a lot of boos for this, but I'm going to put Van at slightly overrated simply because despite the fact that, yes, he did beat Pantoja fair and square, I do think that Pantoja can make that rematch very, very competitive. And as of right now, Joshua Van has a lot of fans, a lot of new fans, a lot of heat and hype behind him right now over his very dominant and honestly very impressive victory over Tatsuro Taira. However, I just don't think he's been as tested as much as I would have liked to rate him the same way everyone on TikTok and Instagram is rating him right now. And I love Joshua Van. I love his energy. I love his fight style. I think he's one of the most prolific boxers we've seen at flyweight since Brandon Moreno in his prime. However, as of right now, from what I'm seeing on social media, I will have to put Joshua Van at slightly overrated. Do I think he's not a good fighter? That's not what I said. I said he's just slightly overrated. But this can change. This can change, and this will change, once he fights Alexandre Pantoja and wins. If he wins that fight, he will go from slightly overrated to properly rated, in my opinion. But that's my take on that. Moving on, we have Alexander the Great Volkanovski. Now, with Volk, I am going to put Volk at properly rated, right? I'm going to put Volk at properly rated simply because what hasn't he done? Can someone genuinely answer me that question? What hasn't Volk done at the featherweight division? I know he lost to Ilya Taporia, and then once Ilya moved up, he, obviously retained his belt again at 145. However, if you look at Alexander Volkanovski's record, if you look at all the things he's accomplished at the featherweight division, what can you really say that he hasn't done outside of his major loss to Ilya Taporia, right? I don't think you can really give me, any major argument or evidence as to what he hasn't done, right? Obviously, we have a potential fight with either, Movsar Evloev, Lerone Murphy, and whoever else we have at featherweight as potential contenders. But as far as being rated goes, people rate Alexander Volkanovski as the greatest featherweight of all time, and I think that is a very fair and accurate assessment. So for that reason, we are going to put Volk today in properly rated. Moving on, we have Piotr Jan. Piotr Jan, Piotr Jan. Now, this is going to sound very biased because for those who know me, I am a huge Piotr Jan enjoyer. I love to watch this man fight. For the past, it's 2026 now, for the past 5 years, I've been telling everyone around me that Piotr Jan will be champ again very, very soon. And he did it against Rob Dvalishvili, who seemed to be unbeatable. Rob, for a very long time, was looking like the guy who Honestly, to this day, I still think Marab probably is the greatest bantamweight of all time, but that can change. That can change because at one point it was Aljamain Sterling, and now we have it as Marab. And I still think that Petr Yan is still in that GOAT conversation along with those other two guys. Um, so for Petr Yan, I am going to put Yan in slightly underrated. I am going to put Yan in slightly underrated simply because some people they still don't really understand the level of greatness that they're seeing when they watch Petr Yan fight. I think Petr Yan has had one of the more unlucky streaks in UFC history. Obviously, that whole, drama with Aljamain Sterling and the illegal knee, and so on and so forth. But if you really look at the way people talk about guys like Alexander Volkanovski, for example, or let's say, for example, at 170, how guys talk about even, Jack Della Maddalena, people were talking about Jack as if, he couldn't be beaten, before he faced Islam Makhachev, who we're going to get to in a few moments, right? But people were talking about Jack as if we've never seen someone as prolific as Jack at 170. When we have someone like Petr Yan at 135 who's been doing this at the top of the game year after year after year after year after year. And for some reason, Yan doesn't get that same level of glaze. So for that reason, I'm going to put Yan in slightly underrated. Moving on, we have Ilya El Matador Topuria. So this is a complicated one because on one hand, you have people who think that Arman Saryukin is going to walk through Topuria. And for those people, I would obviously argue that he's underrated. But then you also have people who think that Ilya is going to go up to 170 and beat someone like Islam or Gary, which for those people, I would say that he would be overrated. So it's a very interesting balance here where you have one end of the spectrum where people think he can't lose, and then the other end of the spectrum where some people think that he's a paper champ or whatever, 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 right? So in my opinion, I'm going to put Topuria in properly rated, because you have both ends of the spectrum because it kind of balances out at the end of the day. You have people who think that he is on his way to being the greatest of all time, which I could agree with. And then you have other people who also believe that he's largely untested, which is so stupid. He pretty much decapitated Charles and Max Holloway and Volkanovski. So for anyone to say that Ilya is untested, just doesn't know ball. You simply don't know what you're talking about, if that is your take. So at this point in time, I'm gonna say Ilya is properly rated. I can't really say that he's overrated, and I definitely can't say he's underrated either. So I think the only place that makes sense for Ilya right now is properly rated. Moving on, we have Sean Strickland. Sean Strickland. Okay, so this one's a little bit complicated, but not really. If we're looking at all time, Sean actually has a very sneaky resume, guys. He actually has a very sneaky, almost I'm leaning towards underrated resume because he defeated what a lot of people think is the greatest striker in middleweight history. I don't agree with the opinion that people think that Adesanya is the greatest striker ever. I think that title still belongs to Anderson Silva, but that's neither here nor there. And he beat undoubtedly the greatest grappler at middleweight history in Hamzat Chimaev, you know. So as far as historical champions go, I am going to put Sean Strickland in slightly underrated. When you talk about the great champions of UFC history, you often don't hear Sean Strickland being put in those conversations. And after his victory over the seemingly unbeatable Hamzat Chimaev, I definitely think there's an argument to be made that Strickland is for sure a top three middleweight of all time. But I might get some flack for that, so who knows? So for that reason, I am going to put Sean Strickland in slightly underrated, right? Moving on, we have Carlos Ulberg. Carlos Ulberg. So he did have a interesting victory over Yuri Prohaska. Um, but was that? I don't know, guys. Was that fight because was the way that fight ended because Ulberg is good, or was it because Yuri did not use his fight IQ? Genuine question. Because if Yuri used his fight IQ, he would have defeated Ulberg decisively. Ulberg was on one leg, you know, Yuri was there from our vantage point would seem to be taunting Ulberg, right? So was that fight won by Ulberg because he's better than Yuri? I don't think so. I don't think he's better than Yuri. Or was that fight won because Yuri did not use his fight IQ or hasn't developed a fight IQ? I don't know. Ulberg's a tricky one. I don't actually know where to put him, to be honest with you. I don't see people calling Ulberg, you know, like a great champion. Of course, since he's new, he hasn't really been tested either. Uh, so I don't really know where to put Ulberg, guys. But to be honest, I might have to put Ulberg in slightly underrated simply because if someone like Yuri Prohaska did not register the danger that was in front of him, perhaps he underestimated Ulberg, you know, because I did see in an interview that Yuri felt mercy for Ulberg, and you definitely can't do that in the octagon for anyone, right? So for that reason, I may have to put Ulberg in slightly underrated. I'm going to be honest, you know. I'm going to have to put him in slightly underrated simply because of this recent outcome with Yuri Prohaska and because Ulberg has sort of been the dark horse of the light heavyweight division for quite some time. And he's just now sort of poking up, above the ice as this new champion. So for that reason, I am going to have to put Ulberg in slightly underrated. Moving on, we now have Tom Aspinall. Tom Aspinall. Ah, this one's also very tricky because if we're judging this based off of his last performance against Cyril Gahn that lasted 2 minutes, you know, in that 2 minutes of fighting that we did observe, Cyril Gahn was getting the best of him, objectively, right? But at the same time, if we look at Aspinall's previous victories before Cyril Gahn, he was running through everyone left, right, and center, 100% finish rate. I think he has, if I'm not mistaken, the fastest finish rate in UFC history. Like fastest cumulative average finish rate in UFC history, right? Don't quote me on that. Somebody fact check me there. But I'm pretty sure that's the case for Aspinall. And a lot of people still, I don't know, a lot of people still talk about Aspinall as if he's not good, especially, given the current champions that we have. People still talk about Aspinall as if he isn't good, but at the same time, people do heavily rate Aspinall at the same time. You have people who say that he would run through John Jones, and then you have some other people who say, all right, Tom, he's good, but he's not that good, right? You know? So for that reason, I am probably going to have to put Tom Aspinall in properly rated. I'm gonna have to put him in properly rated, man, because it's similar with Ilya Taporia, where you have people who think he is untested, which is completely baseless and false, and then you have other people who think that they would destroy everyone that they come across, which may or may not be true, right? But since we have, I would say, an equal amount of people that think both ends of the spectrum, I am going to have to put Aspinall in properly rated. And last but not least, we do have the pound for pound king right now in Islam Makhachev, right? So for Islam, I am definitely going to have to put Islam. I don't know. I really don't know. Islam's a tricky one because Islam, he has clearly proven himself. I think he tied Anderson Silva for the longest win streak in UFC history. I think it's at 16 wins. I think he tied it. And if he beats Ian Gary this upcoming, or this, I think it's August, this upcoming August, he will have surpassed Anderson Silva for the longest win streak in UFC history. And then you have some people who, for some reason, still doubt Islam, which is, wild to me. But for the most part, people understand the level of greatness that they are witnessing, and yeah, the level of greatness that they're witnessing in the UFC at 170. So for that reason, I am going to put Islam in properly rated. He's properly rated, man. He's not underrated. He's not overrated either. I think Islam has a genuine case for being spoken about among top 5 greatest of all time. I think he has a legitimate case for that. And for some reason, some people don't agree, which is wild to me, especially given his recent track record of defeating the likes of Charles, the likes of Jack Della Maddalena, becoming a 2 division champ. Um, but yeah, man, I think Islam belongs in the properly rated category. So if you guys enjoyed this video, if you agree, if you disagree, please feel free to let me know. And I would love to debate you guys in the comments. Peace.